geometry hates cars. If you multiply, I mean, I don't have to tell the war on cars this, but if you multiply, all of the journeys by the space that the car occupies in the road, by the amount of road that you need, by the distance that pushes people apart because you have to build more roads, you are in a Red Queen's race that you cannot win.
Hey, it's Aaron Napperstack here. Welcome to the War on Cars. Remember Uber, the taxi-hailing app with global ambition? Uber was going to be the next Google or Apple or Ford Motor Company. It was going to reshape our cities, give us self-driving cars, and touch everyone's life every day, everywhere around the world. Uber made its public offering in May of 2019. The result was the biggest first-day dollar loss in the history of the U.S. stock market. While millions of smaller investors lost their shirts, Uber's Wall Street underwriters and earliest venture capital backers made piles of money. As for all the hype about Uber being the future of transportation, that vaporized too. Our guest today is Cory Doctorow. He is a prolific novelist, journalist, and technology activist, and he has been a sharp observer and critic of Uber from the beginning. Doctorow's work focuses on themes of individual and communal self-determination in a world where technology monopolies rule, and so much of our cultural, political, economic, and social life plays out on digital platforms over which we have very little control. I had a great conversation with Cory about Uber and what he sees as its fundamental flaws, its inevitable demise, and its likely legacy. But before we get to that, a quick word from our sponsor.
Hey all, it's Doug, and I have to admit I have a problem. With the weather these days, I can never decide on the perfect jacket. I'm like Goldilocks trying to pick the best bowl of porridge. Too cold, too hot, too big, too small. These are not great times for people frozen with sartorial indecision. Thankfully, there's Cleverhood. When it's wet outside, I just throw on my Rover rain cape over whatever I'm wearing without having to think about it, and I'm on my way. Right now, through the end of February, listeners of the War on Cars can receive 20% off anything in the Cleverhood store. Just go to cleverhood.com/waroncars and enter code ONELESSCAR to receive your discount. It's the easiest decision you'll make.
Cory Doctorow, welcome to the War on Cars. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to serve here in the trenches with you in this long, grueling war.
It really is. Are we winning? I'm not.
I think arguably we're losing, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But reality has a well-known anti-car bias, and so over time, I think our victory is assured.
So I reached out to you for this interview because you wrote an essay in the form of a Twitter thread, which is, of course, how all the good essays are written these days. You called it "End of the Line for Uber," and your piece starts, "Uber is a bezel. Every bezel ends. Uber's time is up." So I think we need to start at the start. What is a bezel?
So bezel is a term, I believe, coined by Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith, and it describes the moment in a shell game, in a con game, where the con artist has your money, but you don't know it yet. And it's this kind of moment of suspension, right, where everything is about to change for everyone, right? The con artist ceases to be your friend and goes on the lam. You go from feeling like you're getting a great deal to realizing that you're being ripped off. It is, a moment of great dramatic moment, and also a thing that regularly occurs because, cons eventually end, right? There must have been a moment like this in the Madoff con where people said, wait.
Right.
And, there's also this defensive mechanism, which is the sense that if you've been doing it for a long time, then you surely should be able to do it forever. And that, if it turns out that it was all built on shaky foundations and it wasn't going to last forever, and it couldn't last forever, there's this kind of defensive moment where you're like, no, I'm sure reality is wrong because this thing is very good. And so I just want the good thing to go on. And so could you please adjust the reality?
So the bezel probably usually ends when people want their money back. What is tipping this Uber bezel over the edge, do you think?
Uber always had this kind of shifting web of stories about how they would become profitable and also how they would become sustainable, how it would work in the world. So they were like, well, we are going to subsidize people's rides a lot. We're going to lose like 40 to 50 cents on the dollar for several years. And we're going to also pay a lot of big bonuses to lure people into driving. We'll have these like kind of teaser rates where we'll get people into the cars to drive. And then we're going to do a lot of stuff around the edges. And eventually, like, we're going to figure out how to make up our losses with volume, essentially, right? The old .com joke. We lose $3 on every bag of pet food we sell, but we're hoping to make it up in volume. So there were lots of ways that Uber said it could adjust its cost structure. The first one was that they were going to make us a self-driving car, and that was inevitable. It was just around the corner. They had a research division. There was a race to see who could build the first one. Someday there would be self-driving cars everywhere, and their HR expense would just disappear. They'd be a robot company, not a union busting company. That was where they had one of their first problems, right? Which is that robots don't exist, right? There aren't self-driving cars. We're not near a self-driving car, right? There's just no path to the kind of full autonomous vehicle stuff. And wherever you've heard it, it just turns out to be rubbish, right? Like there was this automation panic at one point where they said, the most popular job in America is truck driver, and you could easily replace heavy rigs, 16 wheelers, with a dedicated lane and some auto follow stuff and LiDAR and whatever. It's like, well, this proposal for self-driving trucks that follow each other on a dedicated lane across America is a shitty train. You have
Right.
just invented
Right.
a shitty train, right? So clearly that wasn't going to happen. And Uber, had its own version of this, and they spent billions of dollars and years claiming that they were seriously making a push for a self-driven car. And I half of me thinks they were making the push, and half of me thinks that it was just this kind of energetic hustle.
So you really think that like the self-driving car pitch might have just been completely a scam?
I don't claim to have any special insight as to how sincere they were in their stupid idea, but I am confident that it was a stupid idea. And one of the ways I know is they had to pay someone else $400 million to take their self-driving car division off of their hands. And at the time, they'd spent, I think, $4 billion on it, and it could go less than a mile without a fatal crash. So, that's the first part, right? Is they weren't going to have self-driving cars. And so that wasn't going to solve the problem. Now, there's another problem, which is that if you could manage self-driving cars, geometry hates cars.
Right.
If you
Right.
multiply, I mean, I don't have to tell the war on cars this, but if you multiply, all of the journeys by the space that the car occupies in the road, by the amount of road that you need, by the distance that pushes people apart because you have to build more roads, you are in a Red Queen's race that you cannot win. I used to work for Disney Imagineering in Glendale and commute down to Disneyland in Anaheim, and they have been widening Highway 5 down in Orange County since the first time I visited when I was 18 years old. I turned 50 this year. It's something like 29 lanes wide,
Right.
and it's still a Hieronymus Bosch painting most of the day, right? And so, geometry hates cars. But assuming that you could defeat geometry with the power of entrepreneurship and gumption and good old American stick-to-itiveness, there's another problem, which is that Uber spent a lot of money on both regulatory adventures and huge subsidies that they paid in order to create the market, right? In order to train people to become riders, in order to eliminate competition through predatory pricing. So all the cab companies went into business. They basically created an Uber-shaped hole in every city. And the question is, why wouldn't someone else also put self-driving cars on the road and just show up on day one to the same investors and go like, you can keep giving Uber money to buy all these self-driving cars, but they're $50 billion in the hole right now. Or you could give the money to us. We'll do exactly what Uber's going to do, but we're not in the hole. So,
Right.
so that Uber was always going to be a failure, right? but Uber had a huge advantage, which was that it was a front for the House of Saud. Now, SoftBank is the executing arm of this. They have $80 billion from the House of Saud, and they uh, have done all kinds of crazy things with it, like WeWork, where they have these accounting. To call them tricks is to like do violence to the noble trick. They have these like
Right.
accounting risible lies where they go like, oh yeah, there's the like generally accepted accounting practices, GAAP, there's EBITDA, there are all these ways to measure the health of a company, but we've got another measure where we measure like the intangibles. Like we know that on paper this company is only worth like $100 million, but when you counted the vibes are like
Right.
super valuable. So their S1, which is the prospectus they give to investors. This is how the Saudis got out, right? This is how SoftBank got out. Is they went public, right? As did all the executives who were doing things like starting self-driving car divisions that failed, but who got giant whacks of stock as compensation to lure them there and keep them there to do this essential business. Whether it was essential because they thought it would work or essential because they thought it would drive an IPO is like anyone's guess, but it was clearly essential to the future of the company one way or the other. And the IPO S1 says our path to profitability involves capturing the majority of our total addressable market, and their total addressable market was every ride that anyone takes in a vehicle, right? Every
Hmm.
train, every tram, every bus, every private car, every taxi in the world.
Right. So our,
And
our market is all transportation in the
yeah,
world everywhere.
Uber will take a piece of it. But the Uber problem is now becoming very clear. So they had a lot of cash, and even with the funny accounting, it's pretty clear that that cash is almost gone.
Hmm.
Like in the last year, it's gone from like 20 billion to 6 billion, and like they're bleeding out like over a billion a year. The reason this was all significant is it was the same quarter that they had triumphantly announced that they'd turned their first profit and were on the path to profitability, and that investors should definitely pile in and like make the last round of suckers whole. And like this was they were headed for like the 1,000-year reign of Uber.
Right.
And what actually happened was there are a ton of countries where you got kicked out of, and you had to sell your business to another grifty rideshare company whose books are even more cooked than yours. And you did it with a stock swap. And so now you're sitting on a bunch of shares of like Didi, which was the Chinese one, that Didi is valuing with a valuation formula that's even more laughable and tissue thin than yours. And on that basis, you are claiming a profit, right? These one time balance sheet adjustments that actually aren't worth what you claim they are, and certainly aren't going to recur, right? Like Uber, this is like Uber saying, oh well, we're finally making a profit because we were forced to sell off divisions and we've got the cash from it, is like I'm finally curing my starvation by eating my own arms. So that's kind of the crux of it here.
So when you're running a Bezel, the question becomes, how do you continue to rope in the new suckers? How do you bring in the new investors? And in your own writing, you've pointed to the work of a transportation analyst named Hubert Horan, who has written dozens of articles since 2016, really deep dives dissecting Uber's public claims and financial statements. And
So Horan released two pieces, and I was writing about both of them. And the second one, this one where he kind of digs into their narrative manufacturing, which is like arguably the thing they're best at making is narratives. And he pointed to this glowing New York Times profile of the new CEO that pointed out that he was like not the kind of guy who would run like a rapey frat boy boardroom. He's not going to do gray balling where they figure out who's a regulator and don't send cars for them so the regulators can't see what the cars are like. He's not going to do any of that stuff that Uber had done before. But what she didn't say, and like then there's this, it's just this kind of long loving profile where he's like,
right, like our CEO isn't like the sociopath who used to be the CEO.
right. He's like hugging his children, and like his wife and he are talking about their favorite Broadway shows, and like, just making him seem like a lovely chap. But what she never points out is that like Uber's problems were, on the one hand, that they were a rampantly criminal enterprise run by a rapey frat bro who is a chronic liar, right? And on the other hand, they were cooking their books and going out of business. And, like, maybe they're not going to have as many like harassment suits to contend with now that,
Right.
they've got like some adult supervision. But this guy is lying about his financials, right? Like he is a crooked con man. So this was the first thing. And then the second thing is the laundered scholarship. So there's a lot of poor quality scholarship that Uber was involved with or directly financed. It gets cited in the Wall Street Journal, which, like, again, like, this is supposed to be the reality-based community, like, not the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, which is all like everything is fine and
Yeah.
nothing is wrong and it'll all be fine. But the actual thing where it's like, here's where you should put your money so that you don't lose all your money, tends to be pretty firmly reality-based. And they're like, the opener to this article citing this research was Uber's business has been proven, which is a hell of a thing to say about a business that is losing money on every dollar it gets.
Right.
Right? That is
Right.
not a proven. Like, yeah, people like a business that costs less to use than it costs to provide. I I would like to have very good $80 bourbon at $3 a bottle. And if you
Right.
offered it for sale, I'd buy it by the case. It wouldn't help you. So this research was like, oh, well, Uber helped communities of color because they were underserved by taxis and transit. And, that may even be somewhat true. There's certainly some people who are credible who say that it's true.
Yeah.
But when Uber goes away, then what? Right? Like, we just have a lost decade of transit advocacy,
Right.
which is the only thing that is actually going to fix things in communities of color that are underserved by transit infrastructure, not this shell game, not this bezel. So
How,
that was the other piece there.
how do you think Uber killed a decade of transit advocacy?
Well, because it created the pretense that we would solve our transit problems with some mixture of gig work, surge pricing. So this kind of, like, they were trying to basically take a supply demand curve, like a Laffer curve, and turn it into drivers, and like just sort of like map it into drivers and cars, uh, so that we would do it with like this kind of, we would create perfect frictionless markets that would were perfectly elastic to go with the demand, and then uh, we would never need transit, right? We wouldn't need taxis, we wouldn't need transit, we wouldn't need walkable cities, we certainly don't need bike lanes. All you need, and of course, you can't have a bike lane in a city full of Ubers because that's where the Uber parks, right? So like Ubers and bicycles are foundationally incompatible.
Though when you talk to the Uber policy guys, and I talked to them a lot in like 2000, mid 2000 teens,
Hmm.
they talked a very good game about wanting to mesh with a transit oriented, walkable, bikeable city. They acknowledged that that wasn't really happening, but is there some version of ride hailing that can work and be beneficial to the city? Is there a version of for-profit transportation service that can work and not be so harmful to the city? Or is this idea just fundamentally rotten?
I mean, transportation's a public good, right? And it has lots of positive externalities that are hard to capture, and that's like the definition of a thing that you cannot run for a profit, right? Effectively, uh, and transportation's dividends arise from doing unprofitable things like connecting poor people who live in exurbs and work in cities with efficient links so that they can get to work without having to take extremely long, circuitous transit journeys that deprive them of the opportunity to look after their health, look after their family, and so on. And since the benefits of transit are so hard to capture for a private firms, just like with other logistics schemes, private firms just cherry pick the good stuff, right? And they fail to deliver on the universality that is necessary to call something a transit system, as opposed to just a way for rich people to get around. Uber, the way that they tried to scale was by enticing people out of other forms of transit and into an Uber, right? That was the whole point of pricing an Uber so cheaply that there were times where, like, even if you weren't like paying yourself for the hours that you were missing because you were on a bus, it was still cheaper than like getting on a subway or whatever.
Right. They weren't competing with the private car parked at the
Yeah.
curbside. That was not their competition. It was transit and it was biking and other taxis.
And I think they did it on purpose, but even if they didn't, it became clear eventually that that's what was happening, right? And again, when you see that Uber is like our only defense is to around, the moat that we plan to build around this business is that we are going to be like just synonymous with travel. We're just there'll just be like stickiness because everyone rides us and thinks of us when it comes to travel. They need to be giant, right? They don't want you to ever not take an Uber because they require so much scale. I mean, it's there in their S1. They require so much scale to be a viable business that if you take an Uber to the subway station, then it's a huge lost opportunity for them, right? They want you to take an Uber to your final destination. And then when you take the subway and you empty it of people and put each of them in an Uber, the city grinds to a halt. And, again, this was like, none of this was difficult to spot. The fact that you cannot replace mass transit with single rider vehicles or two rider vehicles, that you just like, it just doesn't work geometrically. None of that was hard to spot. And Uber just kind of like waved around, they jingled a lot of car keys at us. They were like, but have you thought about self-driving cars? They're cool. And how about the helicopters? The helicopters are going to be great. And just all this kind of like window dressing that's to just keep you from thinking too hard about it. And again, when you're on the upswing with Uber, right, when you're the beneficiary of billions of dollars in subsidy, then it's easy to kid yourself that like, oh, I must just be missing something here. And again, this is one of the things that differentiates transit from travel, is the micro case, the individual case for how to run a transit system is completely unlike the macro case for how to run a transit system. I mean, many's the time I wish that I had a personal helicopter to go to LAX, but
Right.
if everybody got to LAX by personal helicopter, it would rain helicopters on Los Angeles 24/7, just whirling blades and exploding gas tanks everywhere you looked. So
Yeah.
clearly this is not an answer, right? It's a fantasy, right? And so it's fun to fantasize about. I'm a science fiction writer. I like my jetpacks, but it's not a plan. It's a con.
Do you feel the same way about Lyft, Uber's competitor Lyft?
Sure, yeah, they're just an also ran. Lyft's pretense to being the fair trade Uber was always hilarious. I mean, they were slightly less wage thefty about tips at one point, but Lyft's major investor is Peter Thiel, some man who says that women shouldn't be allowed to vote. Like, this is, they are not the cuddly alternative to Uber. They're just another Uber alike.
I kind of look at this whole automobile sprawl industrial complex that we have, the car makers, the suburban sprawl developers, the fossil fuel producers. And to me, it's all a giant bezel. It's all
Sure.
kind of a con, that we get kind of tricked into believing that we need to have our own single family detached house way out in the burbs. And then we need multiple gigantic gas guzzling vehicles to service the house. And then we need all of this arterial roadway and highway to service the far flung cars and homes. And it's all wildly inefficient, expensive, and destructive to the environment. Is the car itself a
Yeah,
bezel?
I mean, I think what you're describing is like that's the kelp forest, and Uber is just like one of the tropical fish that lives in it. You
Right.
know,
Right.
there is a whole ecosystem of this stuff. The pretense that we can keep burning fossil fuels, as you say, and the way that we array our cities, and the effect on public health, and the traffic fatalities, and all of this stuff. Right? I mean, it's really clear that it's not sustainable, and the way that we make it work is by incurring all kinds of different debt. So we have a carbon debt, we have a policy debt, we have a public health debt. All the people who have chronic illnesses because of the emissions from cars and from roads and whatever. We
And
have
even just being sedentary, like never
right.
walking anywhere.
Yeah, we have a heat island debt from roads that change the Earth's albedo. We have all of these different debts, and they will eventually default, right? And we keep rolling them over, uh, but we're going to hit a wall. Like we're going to eventually run out of our ability. Like that's why it's a bezel, right? Because the bezel, the con artist who's running the show eventually has to admit that you can't drive a car in a city that's been burned down. And eventually you just have to kind of confront it and do something about it. You know, I've got one of the novels I wrote during the lockdown is a book, a Green New Deal utopian novel called The Lost Cause. It's about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias
Wow.
after a Green New Deal transition. And, you know, the difference between this utopia and a climate dystopia is not what's going on in the world. The world is on fire in my book, literally and figuratively. There are floods, there are fires, there's zoonotic plagues, there's hundreds of millions of refugees on the move, there's famines, there's all of the things that we know will arrive as a result of climate change. And the difference between that and a dystopia is that everyone admits that they're there and is actually orienting themselves towards doing something about them. They're like embarking on a 200-year program to move every coastal city 20 kilometers inland, right? Like this is the, you know, so it's the difference between being in a bus that's barreling towards a cliff that even if the driver manages to yank the wheel, it's going to roll 3 times and maim half the people on the bus, and being on a bus that's barreling towards the cliff and the driver isn't going to yank the wheel and you're all going to die. Right. And I think that, like, you know, actually taking the wheel, even if you end up in a situation that's less than ideal, that taking the wheel is always going to be preferable to barreling over the cliff. And, you know, that's the bezel we're in right now. We are in this moment where we're pretending that we can build our cities this way, pretending that we can run our transit this way, that we can source our energy this way. And it would be great if we didn't have to take all of the pain that we're going to have to take to reorient our productive capacity and our lifestyles around remediating climate change. But that's not going to happen, right? We are going to have to make really radical shifts, and, you know, they won't all be bad. Like, the other thing about this utopian novel is they're living in a utopia. Like, they're actually, like, one of the things that they do is when the renewable energy isn't available, they all just take a day off. Right.
Yeah,
so
right.
like, you know, like, and they have amazing networked computers that are like Facebook, but not predatory and awful, that don't commodify your relationships, but improve your relationships so that they can find other people to take the day off with and do fun stuff. And they live a life of great leisure and pleasure, and a life in which the existential terror that we have is mitigated by the sense of agency and doing something about it. And that's what I mean by a lost decade, because we spent a decade just pretending that there was no way to yank the wheel and instead saying maybe this bus can fly, right? We're going to get to the cliff edge and we're just going to fly because Elon Musk has a flying bus and Uber's got a flying bus. Everyone's working on flying bus technology. Haven't you heard? It's going to happen right after self-driving cars, long before we hit the edge of the cliff.
How does it end? What do you expect? I mean, even just your sci-fi novelist self, how does the bezel end?
Well, I mean, whenever these things end, they sometimes end with a rupture. You just become a liability on the public purse, right? Because we've got to figure it out. There are some times where it goes through like an orderly restructuring, goes through a bankruptcy. It might even get life support, right? I mean, part of Uber's gambit is clearly like, or maybe its plan B is too big to fail. And so it might become too big to fail. You might see some cities assuming it, especially like smaller cities that gave up on bus service in favor of an Uber subsidy. In the meantime, it's going to destroy a bunch of people's lives, right? Like, it really will. There's a lot of drivers who depend on it. And then, you know, we'll have its lasting legacy, which is the formalization of misclassification of workers through Prop 22, which is going to the Supreme Court here in California, may or may not survive, and the ballot initiative that they just dumped $100 million into in Massachusetts to basically Prop 22 Massachusetts. And so you'll have this enduring legacy of precarious, formalized precarious work that deprives workers of the right to organize and the right to be recognized as workers. So, you know, that's the long-term legacy. We're going to have to dig ourselves out of that hole for a long time, you know.
Well, Cory Doctorow, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Lovely to chat with you too.
Hey, that's it for this episode of The War on Cars. For more of Cory Doctorow's work, his daily links, his books, his podcast, go to pluralistic.net. or the War on Cars store at bookshop.org. We've got some new Patreon rewards, including an official War on Cars water bottle. Go to thewaroncars.org, click Support Us, and enlist today. If you have not already, we will send you stickers, and you will have access to special, exclusive content. A shout out to our top Patreon sponsors, Charlie G. of Human Powered Law in Portland, Oregon, and the Law Office of Vaccaro & White here in New York City. Also Virginia Baker and James Doyle. Thank you so much. You guys are the joint chiefs of the War on Cars. And of course, thanks to our longtime sponsor, Cleverhood. For 20% off on the best rain gear for biking and walking, go to cleverhood.com/waroncars. When you check out, use coupon code ONELESSCAR. That's good through the end of February. This episode was produced and edited by me, Aaron Naverstack. Thanks again to Cory Doctorow for taking the time to chat. On behalf of my co-hosts, Doug Gordon and Sarah Goodyear, this is the War on Cars.
All of the people who say we're near a self-driving car because some minor subset of the self-driving car problem has improved in some way over the last couple of years are like people who say we have bred this horse to be so fast that it's only a matter of time until it's a railroad engine.